Thank you all for being here this afternoon on the occasion of the opening of The Time Is Always Now. Thank you very much, Jordan and Thomas, for being here on this stage. I want to just check quickly. How many people have seen the show already? Hands up. Just good, because we're going to talk about the work in the show. So that's helpful. If you haven't, there's still time to see it after this and for the next couple of months. I just want to start off and just want to get into it a little bit. I want to ask both of you about the process of making Jordan, you've got 3 paintings in the show. Yes, I want to start with James as a figure. Let's talk about this particular painting, the particular figure that you paint in that work, how you came to that work. Get some background and some context.
First of all, glad you're all here. Thank you so much for bringing us here. We wouldn't be here without you and without PMA. So it's a real honor to be able to share space this afternoon on a Saturday, nonetheless, where it's beautiful outside. So hopefully we create some beauty in here. And I think that ultimately for me, my practice is rooted in a sense of trying to build communities for myself. And James is a real anchor for me in my practice and kind of the origin story of my seeking of community and people that I love and building relationships. James was somebody that I saw on 127th and Lenox in Harlem. And
this was, so you're a resident at the Studio Museum?
Yes, I was a resident at the Studio Museum at the time. And so I just moved to Harlem, was trying to figure out how to contextualize myself in this new environment, but also wanting to introduce myself to this new environment. I knew it was a monumental time in my life, and I wanted to kind of enrich everything possible, or kind of seep out of it everything that I could. And it started with the people on the street, the vibrancy. There was such a draw for me to be outside and want to get to know the community that was so present. I could hear them from within my studio.
So how much did you know Harlem before then?
Not at all, really. I guess in the theoretical sense of Harlem as being a mecca of Black culture and experience, and the Harlem Renaissance was something I had heard of and understood. And I guess there were some figures that I maybe knew lived and worked in Harlem, but it was the first time that I'd really spent any substantial time there.
Well, let's hold that for a moment and let's think about, so you arrive in Harlem at the Studio Museum. From where you come from?
So I'm born and raised in Denver, Colorado. Yeah. I then did my college degree in Atlanta, Georgia, at Agnes Scott College. And then I went back to Colorado for a year and taught special education, actually. And then when I pursued my MFA, I ended up at the Yale School of Art in Connecticut. And when we were graduating, everybody was like, you go to LA or you go to New York, or else you will never be an artist. And I was like, oh, okay. I guess I'm going to LA or New York. And I said I would give myself a year in New York because it was quite stressful, honestly, as a Coloradan. I was totally intimidated. And I was living in Ridgewood in Queens at the time with a roommate. And I was basically finding any free space I could get through residencies. I had a residency on Governor's Island. I would travel anywhere that somebody said, here's a space, in order to make work. And of course, I applied to the Studio Museum as such an iconic residency that has housed and supported so many Black artists. And I got that call from Thelma and almost got hit by a car. And she literally, I just was like, what? Like literally. And she was like, are those cars honking? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, go sit down, like get out of the street and sit down. Because I just could not register what was happening, because I knew it was going to be transformational. And I found home there. I found a community amongst Black artists around people who were really believing in my ability to make and be whoever I wanted to be. And so James was a part of that origin story for me.
And this is one of the first works you made.
Yeah, it was the first work that I made.
So just to be clear, this is the portrait of James, yes, that we're looking at on the far,
yeah,
the youth far left here. Yeah. And that was the first, and you photographed him?
Yeah, I photographed him. I am incredibly not the person necessarily who would naturally approach people, which is so the opposite of my practice, but that's sort of intentional, as I would probably be a recluse in a tree somewhere if I did not have some mode of engaging with people around me. And so this practice began with me and a camera walking around Harlem. And I walked past James actually when I saw him because I was so intimidated by this gorgeous figure being hit by the light. Like the sun was, he was just golden. And I was like, that person just looks like a painting, but I cannot introduce myself. And I turned back around, I kind of walked a block and gave myself a pep talk and decided to turn back around and introduce myself and just said, hi, my name is Jordan. And I'm a resident at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Do you know what that is? And honestly, at that time, he was like, nope, got no idea what you're talking about. And I was like, it's right around the corner. Do you know that flag? There's a David Hammond's red, black, and green flag that hangs in front of it. And he said, yeah, I do know that flag. And I said, well, there's a museum and I'm a painter and my goal is to get you on the walls of the museum. If you would let me take your photograph, I would like to try to make a painting. And he agreed. It just was like, okay, like whatever. And I took a photo and I said, I took his address, his phone number and his contact information. And I said, I'm serious and I want you to see the work when I finish it. And there was an open studios where I invited him in to see it. And he was expecting a drawing because he literally said, oh my God, I was expecting a drawing or something. And I got to go get my wife. And so that's what's led to painting number 2 is Yvonne walked in wearing the exact same suit he was wearing, but in skirt form. And I realized very quickly that they matched every day and that she was never far behind. So the fact that I caught him on a day without her was actually quite rare. So then I went on a mission to capture them both.
So this is the other thing to say, that the second painting, as it were, that we're also showing, James and Yvonne, is the painting of both of them together. This is the painting that we see in the middle here.
Yeah, they became home for me. So I really wanted to capture the light. That painting of James, like I really wanted to capture the golden statuesque quality that I felt like he had that afternoon.
I want to come back to all of this.
That's a lot.
Thomas, let's come to you for a moment. The sculpture work that we have in the show, A Sound Turns to Noise. I'm going to ask you the same question. How do you come to make that work?
This is a result of, excuse me, a result of many years of experimenting with the way I approach, I guess, the figure and the idea of identity, and particularly the way that materials are used to imbue a sense of status to, well, individuals. But in this case, it's a fictional character. So I call them characters. Because I remember when I first started looking at basically ideas of portraiture, I didn't want to make this like the same, an alternative, as in like, I didn't want it to be just as good as. So here is a Black person as an emperor kind of thing. I really wanted to get into what we were trying to do with portraiture and what I was trying to do with portraiture and what were the values attached to the desire to be represented as a literal form of oneself. And so I decided to create fictional characters. And I always said there were these fictional characters built around emotional frameworks. So fictional people to represent very real states of being. And so As Sounds Turns to Noise has come from, the first work I did was a very small piece, very small plaster work. It was called Mixed Feelings About Bus Drivers. And it was a tiny little, a plaster head with marble dust in it on a scrap wood shelf, stuck on the wall quite low down. This is when I was at the Royal College of Art, stuck on the wall, on this huge wall between 2 columns with 1 screw in the wall, because that's what kept it up. It didn't need 2 screws, so I used 1 screw. And so everything about the installation, about the scale, about the material, about the expectations for that space and the expectations for that format, i.e. portraiture and sculpture, was there to be scrutinized. And I really didn't want to make something which was just, now I'm doing it. And so, sorry, I should talk about what's here, shouldn't I? So with that said, I then got into using the material of power, of permanence, of authority, bronze. So it carries with it all these connotations, all this lustrous history. And so when I first used bronze, I patinaed it black. I used heat and chemicals to make the surface black, because I didn't want it to look like a bronze sculpture. I wanted to kind of critique, again, our understanding of material value. I wanted to make it look like something everyday, like a high quality plastic or something, so people would question what they're looking at. But with this piece, so this comes from an original series I did when I had a show in LA, downtown LA, and I got people to turn up to a casting. I thought, well, we're in LA, the place where everybody wants to make it or be seen or become a star. And what happens if I get people to turn up to a casting, but then the resulting object, the resulting character isn't them. So it's about looking at the desire to be seen, that desire to be understood, and looking at what the vehicle can be to get to that point.
I mean, the important point to make is that these are composite works, as it were.
Exactly. So yeah, so they're composite work. So I had many people turn up, and what I would do is I'd interview the people. So importantly for me, and I love the way that you're talking about approaching people in the street. I tried to do that back in the day, and I didn't get good responses in London. I'm glad I was wearing sneakers. So I used to spy on people, so because I really want to get people in their sort of unconscious moments, the truthful moments, which are non-performative for me. That's what I say. The moments where you're fully yourself, you're absorbed into whatever's going on in your head, and then to see if somebody else can pick that up. And so for me, creating these composite amalgams, these characters, these fictionalized versions of emotional states, and then presenting the materials like in bronze, and then at scale. I love playing with scale. So what I never do is a 1-to-1 scale. But what I have here is, it's a 9-foot sculpture of a fictionalized woman. But I hope we can recognize the humanity in it, the familiarity, like the lack of pretense, the lack of trying to dominate a space in a controlling way. For me, it's about that vulnerability in being oneself and being open to misinterpretation. And the power that comes from not worrying about being misinterpreted. I don't, especially Black people in space, I'm really scared about being misinterpreted. And so to present works which revel in the material luster and grandeur and in spaces where people can see themselves being free, basically.
I mean, let's talk about scale for a moment, because I think it's really interesting in both of your ways of working. So with these works, Jordan, James, and then James and Yvonne, these are large paintings. Interested interested in the tension between intimacy and scale, I suppose. How do you maintain this sense of proximity, emotional connection? You're working quite a large canvas.
I think it's so interesting. I love being able to be in proximity to artists that you admire and curators that you admire, because I'm like, yeah, actually, there's so much that we have in common that we probably would never have talked about before this moment, because I think that I similarly am always trying to challenge the perceptions of like a body in space, and what it means to have an intense amount of vulnerability and intimacy. Because what's interesting about your sculpture too is that her eyes are closed, where all of my portraits, their eyes are open. And
yeah, there's a direct gaze.
And usually that direct gaze for me is so important in that they're looking at me. Like I've always thought of them as me being very active in all of the portraits and very present in them, because actually the first gaze is one of my own. It's because of the intimacy that I have garnered in the relationship or in this contact with a person, that they have trusted me to let me in, that then becomes their gaze back at me. And the scale becomes very intentional. I think I always liked to play with these conceptions of how, as somebody who has always felt like a wallflower, to make these people that I know and love kind of bigger than that and be very present, that the colors could challenge that the scale, that they could walk out of the frame and stand taller than the room. The intimacy for me when working on that scale is like me on a scaffolding, literally like going up and down and being very close and then far. My body it's a dance that occurs in the studio when making these works. And there is a very intimate part of that, even in their grandeur.
I wanted to ask you, Thomas, so Thomas's work, this is the only work that was commissioned for The Time Is Always Now. It's the only work that was made. Yeah, it's the only work that was made specifically in conversation with an artist. And when we approached you, wanted to work with you, I had in mind smaller work.
You hadn't met my ego, had you?
You were very clear about how you thought the work could work. And to be clear, it absolutely does work. But I want to ask this question about, okay, well, look, what do you see and why? How does scale work for you? In which ways does it matter? And in which ways are you manipulating that and thinking about that?
Easy questions.
No, you go.
Yeah, right. I've been fascinated with scale since I was a child, honestly. I mean, I used to look at cracks in the wall and imagine myself being tiny and living in these cracks in the walls. That's just what I used to do. And so, you know, moving through the world, growing up and being highly sensitive to the idea of scale, but also just in terms of status or value or power or safety in the world, I think for me, when I started to increase scale, it allowed me to present figures in a way that perhaps could be more vulnerable, but the scale counterbalanced that potential vulnerability. Because what I didn't want to do was create figures that were, pathetic, as in like were victims or that where the balance would be off to the kind of where you felt sympathy. I wanted people to feel connected and empathy, but not sympathy. I want people to be able to pour themselves into that psychological space that's between themselves and the sculpture, and I don't know, like really bring themselves to the works in a way that encouraged an openness from the viewer to be aware of that initial response to the work, that initial emotional response to the work, like when we meet somebody. But I don't know about you, but when I meet somebody, I'm trying to remember names, I'm trying to do all these things go on, but I wanted to really create a space that was conducive to an exploration of one's own feelings in that moment and awareness of that feeling in the moment. And I think, you know, with the sounds turn to noise, it's almost like the figures reflecting back to you that contemplation. And is a sort of, I don't know, there's something about the eyes closed. Like, so when I was doing portrait heads, you know, these kind of psychological, smaller scale heads, some of the eyes were closed because it was a bit like that cinema of the mind. I wanted to kind of give people a little prompt to go back into themselves before looking again. But a lot of the times, you know, the eyes of my characters are open. And with the sculptures, I scoop the eyes out so that they're kind of hollow. So I always feel like that allows the viewer to kind of fill that last detail of psychological significance. And the sculptures never look directly at the viewer because it's not about trying to look for that that sort of I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. The kind of not authority. Admiration, that's a nice word. We can go around doing words. Yeah, that's a good word. No, yeah, the recognition, it's almost as if they're self-contained. And there's something about creating a moment of confidence in a sculpture of a type of person who's normally only ever being presented as a racial type or some sort of heroic type, but it's very much just human. It's just being human. And there was some sort of like shift in that power dynamic between institution, if they're shown there, or just, I don't know, something about making somebody who's not being performative for me was this rebellious act. And I did it from quite an early age, and I didn't quite know what I was doing, but I knew that the responses I was getting from tutors and from people and audiences was like, well, that's not what it's supposed to be. And that made me realize people have a sense of what it's supposed to be. And I love what you're saying, Jordan, about, you know, that first moment of why your figures look directly into our eyes, because it's that intimate relationship and that trust that you have with that subject. But for me, it was about presenting a moment within sculptural language, which rejected this idea of having to look for approval. That's the word I was looking for. And for me, it was just a really important thing to kind of stay away from this sort of like, you know, I need you to exist.
It's when I was working on this exhibition, for a long time early on, I was very anxious about the show and whether we'd be able to pull it off, because one of the things that worried me was the possibility, I suppose, that get to the end, you put up the show, and it would be seen as just a collection of works by Black artists, you know, stuff on the wall, stuff standing in space, that signified nothing other than presence, depiction, representation. For me, this is the start point, not the end point of a work. But I wanted to play that back with you, because sticking on scale for a moment, there's especially let's say with sculpture, it's a possibility of heroizing, valorization, hagiography that comes with that. Even with portraiture, the classical, the history of portraiture is about the heroic individual within the frame. So I want to ask both of you how you, not even resist that, how you look beyond that. How are you working towards, to take Thomas's point, how are you working towards the human in there?
Ourselves first. I mean, for me, it's so about like as a human without being fully human and connected to my own sense of being in the world, and then seeing reflections of myself. I've often found, or I guess in recent years, as I look back at a painting of James and kind of the origin story, at that time, in many ways, I was working in self-portraiture, in essence. I think it was about their humanity and wanting their humanity to be seen. But I think it was also about them being surrogates to my own desire for humanity and to be seen. Again, that wallflower notion, the sense that it's interesting because I also think I'm like thinking so much listening to you both, but I'm a tall person. I kind of always existed in space in a large capacity, but also wanted to be invisible and felt invisible. And I wanted to create through these portraits what maybe I hadn't felt myself per se, and wanting to reflect that back. And I think the humanity in addressing that comes from being fully present with people in my environments as much as possible, and in a nuanced capacity, that there's so many ways that, yes, like as a portrait painter, painting people of color, just as your fears of that people would see the show and say, okay, check, almost just like I see it, I get it, so be it. But really, there's so much nuance between all the ways that we are working, because we are also individual ourselves. Our own humanity is present within this exhibition. I think the diverse work that is represented in this exhibition is so palpable to me, and all of the modes of making that we are seeing the world so differently. And our representations are in our hands and in our gestures. So I guess I think about it in the context of my own work in the same way, and kind of wanting to show up and say, hi, my name is, that's the first step.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that chimes with me very much so. And this idea of being invisible, the idea of being overlooked or assumed to be something else, or, not belong. And then to try and create something which makes a statement about, we always belong. We've always been here. But I have to say, when I first started sculpting images of people, I came from a background of performance and video work. I did it because I wanted to create a very immediate connection between the work and an audience on an empathetic kind of level. And I was sculpting people and humans and characters and feelings and emotions. And it wasn't until I showed the first, I used to do stop motion animation. And it wasn't, and then the first one was of two white people. And it wasn't until I did the third one, which was a black man. And I was told, but this is a black man. Why have you done this? And I was like, I'm sculpting emotions, feelings. Look how he's feeling. Are you getting into the rhythm of this, this time-based medium here? And I realized that there was a resistance or an inability for the predominantly white audience to get into this at the time. This is 2001. And that's when I realized that I was probably gonna have to engage in something a little bit more overtly conscious about race and place and material and my place within this discussion and in this sort of history of making works and presenting works. I think, making work is one thing, but showing the work and getting feedback is another thing. So I was sort of forced into labeling these works. But for me, they've always been people and humans first. And that's what I thought people were seeing with me. And it makes you wonder, so what are people looking at when they look at me? And that's what continued, that's the loop that I've sort of been into with making works. Like, what are you seeing? What if I present this, because this physiognomy, this arrangement of facial features, what character do you see? If I present this race or this mixture of people, what do you see? And So I've always just tried to create humans. And so I gave up worrying about being racialized a long time ago because it's already happened, you know?
It's so interesting. One of the experiences being Black is about being witness to your own body. It's about being witness to your own body and having that played back to you by other people. Du Bois talked about this with double consciousness. Fanon talked about this with this passage, Look a Negro in Black Skin, White Mask. This thing of having other people play back to you that. This may or may not be, but I'm picking up on something that you said, Jordan. How much of your paintings, how much of your sculptures, how much of these self-portraits, how much of these have you in them?
I'm entirely in them. Like, I remember, it's interesting listening. I had the exact same experience. I remember being in graduate school and making a portrait of my friend Corey, and a Black man, and he was wearing a Nike You Mad shirt. And I had a studio visit where they came in and I was like, yeah, I'm just painting a human. Like, it was like, I'm painting a person. And the studio visit was like, whoa, what are you trying to say here? Like, what is this Black man telling me? And I was like, whoa, I hadn't even, actually, You Mad shirt had nothing. Like, I don't, what? Like, I was so confused. And I made the decision. I remember having a very similar moment as you where I was like, oh, like, I'm gonna have to reckon with this more directly and more explicitly. And that's when I started doing the nudes of Black men. I was like, oh, bet. I'm also a little bit of a contrarian, where I was like, bet if the shirt is a problem, I'm gonna get rid of the whole thing. Like, gone, no problem. Now what? So then it was like, literally, like, there was some part of me, I remember the first crit presenting the first nude, and they also didn't know it. It was like, but are you only painting Black people? No, it became, or the people entered the room, but it was like, but he's a Black. It was like, now they had to reckon with this nude Black man laying on his couch who was also pink. He wasn't even Black. Like, I was like, I'm gonna make you think about all of this. And my whole entry point into the art world began with that body of work. It put me on the map because I think people were like, you're painting nude Black men, but it was forcing them to reckon with all the things I wanted them to reckon with, which was their own desire to place a subjugation on a body that they then had to reckon with. They had to reckon with the nuance of the decisions that I had made in my representation. And because my name was Jordan and nobody knew me at that time, I'd be at my own openings. I remember my mother, there's a moment very specifically where I hear her across the room being, she's over there, because people were walking around being like, where is he? And I love that. I think that was the moment that my presence was so explicitly clear, that I loved that people made so many assumptions about who could be making that work. And then they would encounter me. And I was a young Black woman making this work of Black men and challenging their own kind of nuance and their vulnerability, and asking other people to be vulnerable with them by asking questions about who has the right to do what and be where. So I think that, and I remember saying at that time that it was like, you paint Black men and you only, because there was a lot of boxing around my practice.
Yeah, there was even this thing, why is she only painting men?
Oh, it's 10 years ago. Okay. And my practices evolved. But even then, I remember then I was like, but I'm right here. It was always about me in conversation with these subjects. And I felt ignored and ignored and ignored. And then I was like, here's a woman. And I painted Bay Falls, and then that it was always self-portraiture, is a long way of saying that. For me, it always felt like this active stance, that I was so present in the decision-making.
Wow.
Sorry.
No, it's amazing. It's so funny because I went from doing these animations to a series of nude figures, very small. And again, it was about scale. It was about creating this sense of vulnerability, but also an opportunity, I think, for us to see ourselves in a position of vulnerability without being weak, or without it being a fault. Yeah, actually being a powerful thing, to be able to be vulnerable and not to lose your position in society, to be vulnerable and to not be judged in a way that means you lose out, you miss out, or you never are able to come back from that point, in terms of your character or your position in society. But I remember I showed up in Chicago for the first time, and men mainly couldn't handle it because their genitals were out.
Yeah, because they're these small, nude, and then
Small,
they're
and they got
unheroic.
pot bellies, or they're like, they're old, or they're just standing or slouching. And the idea was to not use heroic body language. The idea was to totally go contra to that, and again show what we actually look like, how we actually feel, and celebrate ourselves in our natural states, and not have to be part of this pretense of being heroic in a very like performative way. But I was told, like, if you just had a gun in front of the genitals, that would like make it so much more bearable. I'm like, this is wild. Like, it's just, yeah, like there was the things that you said to me throughout my practice is crazy. But in terms of like how much of me is there, I think psychologically speaking, it's my attitude towards trying to approach life. It's I will not pretend to be something else. I remember that from my mother instilled that in myself and my brothers very early on. We lived in a pretty rough area, and we'd get in a lot of trouble because we wouldn't pretend to be something else. We would go through and just take the consequences. And I remember being like a waiter in the gallery world back in London, and being invisible. But I would always stand up straight, and I would, I felt like, I don't know, it's like trying to just maintain your dignity and maintain your sense of self in a way that's authentic. And again, I keep saying the word, but non-performative. So you're not trying to like play up to somebody else's expectations. And so for me, it's the not having to get somebody's eye contact to feel valid, to not have to, I don't know, present myself in a certain way. But physically, obviously, people always look for like, oh, is that you? Is that bit you? But I put together so many different parts of different people in the works. I often bring my brothers into the work. So perhaps because we have similarities, so maybe there's a bit there. But I spy on everybody, and everybody kind of makes it into the work at some point. I used to take notes when I was traveling on transport, public transport. I have people sit for me, and I say I kind of 3D scan people now, so I kind of chop them up digitally and like create these kind of Frankensteins and then resculpt. But I think it's the psychological aspect for me. That's where I reside.
I mean, I think both sets of your work begin from a presumption of psychological complexity. And I remember when I first saw these paintings that you're talking about, male nudes, they're in greens, they're in purples. I had this jolt of recognition at those figures, because you and knowingness, an already scripted version of Black naturalism, realism. They begin from a presumption that we work out from the interior. That's what seemed exciting to me. Equally, these small sculptures I love, because again, yeah, they're ordinary, I don't even know the word, kind of humble, in these nude men without glory to them, absolutely in mundanity. But I wonder if you can speak about that for a moment, about, let's say this, why the everyday is important. Jordan, you're painting people on the street, you're painting people on the subways. Why this sense of looking at this quotidian world?
Historical recognition and kind of this counterplay, and wanting the everyday to kind of enter very institutionalized spaces that haven't necessarily valued the everyday. Even I guess historically, it's been a king where there's kind of a value placed on the person who could get a portrait. But I guess I think that there's so much value. If I think back to my own upbringing, the best example that I can give as to why I started kind of paying attention to the everyday was that in in college, when I arrived on campus, my mother, we had listened to I had my orientation, it was the deans, it was all sorts of people around, but she said afterwards, okay, cool, we've heard from the deans, we've heard from the president, but I'm going to take you where the real kind of like kings and queens of what will be your lands are. And she took me into the cafeteria and introduced me to Betty, who was I love to bake. That's it's not a secret, whatever. I love to bake. And she was like, Betty, like, hi, this is my daughter, Jordan. She loves to bake. And I assume she will see you every day. And I want to know that she is loved and cared for. That happened again when I moved to Brooklyn for the first time and I couldn't find her. I had found this apartment on Craigslist and I was like, where's my mom? She was across the street smoking cigarettes with the corner boy, like the guys on the corner. And I was like, what is, like, you know? And then she comes in and I was like, what was that? And she was like, they're the ones on the block. Those are your kings. And they are the ones who will keep you safe. These are the people that you need to know. They know when you're, the reason they're on that corner is they know who's coming and going. And I want them to know that that you are loved and that they should let me know if you don't come home, you know, like they got my number now. Like, and every day I pass by and they're like, how's your mom, Miss Lauren? You know, like every day I was like, no, she's great. Is she coming back to town soon? But I do think there is a quality to that is very important for me and how who I'm painting in the everyday is that I was taught very young that even tonight that or this after I don't know what day at time it is. I just basically this afternoon. Like the gratitude also comes to those who serve us, that there are people holding cameras, there are people that are functioning on the periphery to make a day like this happen. And I've always wanted to meet those people and give them just as much credit as the person up here with a microphone.
Thomas, can you talk? Well,
Yeah, okay. But it's true. It's true.
we're going to go to questions in about 5 minutes, but I just want to ask you a question, Thomas, about making work in the public realm, which you do. You've made a number of sculptures that sit in public spaces. Can you, in Hackney in London, also in Rotterdam, you talk about the reactions to creating these large-scale sculptures of Black people, having them in public spaces, how people respond to that?
Mixed. I always say that again, it's dealing with expectations of the formats, of the materials, of the idea of representation, portraiture, particularly monuments. You know, it's a well understood kind of artwork, which we are conditioned to expect certain things and to actually support those renditions of that, you know, when it conforms to that type of presentation. So when you just shift something subtly, when you change who is shown, or when it's not an actual person, because people always ask, who is it? Because they want to be able to contextualize themselves in terms of the value system that we've constructed around ourselves and where they sit with this person. So do they approve of the representation or the placement of that person in that position of grandeur, of value, of high status in relation to themselves? And if it's of a fictionalized person, that kind of annoys people. And it brings out the reality of the areas that these works go into, because, you know, for example, I won't use the example actually, but but you know, a city might think it's very liberal and accepting and varied and forward thinking, and then one of these works goes there, and then
One of these works of a large-scale Black person.
Well, a Black person, particularly Black person, goes there, and it brings out the toxins, I would say, of, you know, the things that need to be leached out and exposed and dealt with and cleansed, so the place can actually become the thing it says it is. And so for me, it's been really, and also this is not just one side of the society saying that. We've all conditioned to expect certain things. So there's a variety of people who feel like that's not what it should be, or because we've been told if you work hard enough, if you do just enough of the right kind of thing, you too can be valid and you can go on top of this plinth. I don't even use plinths, so I put them on the ground that we share with them. You know, okay, they're of a certain scale, but we share that platform with them. So it's about making us more aware of our relative value to the way that we've been groomed to partake in a system that actually ultimately holds us down. So the reaction is varied, because some people see it for what it is. It's a moment to see humanity celebrated in a natural state where you are valid. You don't have to do anything else. You can step out of your house and you immediately exist in a form that is valuable and should be celebrated. And you should be able to see that in someone else and celebrate that in someone else. But the seduction of being special, the seduction of being exceptional in order to be valid, is so overwhelming because of the way it's reinforced through our very culture, you know, in terms of screenplays, music, books, interactions with one another. We are fed this formula for success, or for just to be a valuable human being that is very hard to get rid of. And you talk about toxins. And so I think for me, you know, it's always interesting because depending on where the work goes, it brings out other things. And it also, just very importantly, I will stop because I know we've got time. It brings out the people who can see what I agree with, see what should be valuable. And it brings out the voices. It gives a point of focus to the voices who I feel have a way forward that brings us all along with each other. And so
there are archives being built all around us, but in our own collecting and our own storytelling and our own recalling and our own making and our gestures in the world and moving towards them, that we are leaving a path for others to follow. Every decision, it is daunting at times. Sometimes as I join certain positions, or I feel a certain responsibility, or I speak in a certain way that I feel responsible for. But as genuinely, as you just said, that we have to remember that we cannot, as artists, carry the responsibility of changing the world per se, but I can do my best to care for the stories that I know and that I tell, and hope that with the care that I give them and the care that I give the story of Thomas's work, that the care that I tell for many generations, that care will be carried forward, quite literally.
Right. I spend my time curating exhibitions and writing books. Most of the things I do gravitate around Black aliveness, gravitate around articulating or trying to explore the richness and complexity, and sometimes the strangeness, and sometimes the wonder of Black life. Try and hold that and put that into the historical record and recognize the work for what it is, work that exists now, but continues to speak into the future. But that seems to me something that at least it's possible to do, that within the wake, hold our heads up, we can continue to swim, we can continue to speak, we can continue to walk through a world, even against that world, even understanding the resistance that we meet. And the thing that takes us forward is the work. The work is a beacon. The beauty of the work can lead us. Thank you so much for joining us here. I know we've just done an applause, but let's do one last thing for Thomas J. Price and Jordan Casteel. Thank you very much.